Federal indictments against James Comey and Letitia James thrown out. Why? The prosecutor who brought the charges illegally appointed. Ukraine, the U.S., and Europe keep talking. Which is better than the pro-Russia near-ultimatum peace deal Ukraine got last week? Housing is too expensive. Everyone seems to know it, but remedies are years away. We are all collectively in the idea phase, so we here are going to explore some. Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to the Takeout. The indictments against former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Letitia James, gone. The cases were rushed and of such dubious legal foundation that career prosecutors resisted. That included the interim U.S. Attorney Eric Siebert, who resigned before he was about to be fired by President Trump over this very matter. Trump then posted on social media that the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, should hurry up and prosecute Comey and James. Then came the appointment of Lindsay Halligan as interim U.S. Attorney, and the indictments soon followed. There is a lot to get into in today's judicial ruling nullifying these indictments, and Scott MacFarlane will, as always, guide us confidently and ably through that. But one thing stands out, at least to me. When Halligan's appointment was challenged and appeared on shaky ground, the Trump Justice Department did something very unusual. More than a month after Halligan's original appointment, it said she was not only interim U.S. attorney, but also a, quote, special attorney, doing the attorney general's legal bidding, and that this special status was retroactive. Considering Trump's request of Bondi to speed up prosecutions, this made the legal chain of command, how should we say, abundantly clear and bothersome to the court. Accepting this approach, the court said, quote, would mean the government could send any private citizen off the street, attorney or not, into the grand jury room to secure an indictment so long as the attorney general gives her approval after the fact. That cannot be law. And so it is not the law. The White House late this afternoon said this is not the final word. James Comey has had plenty to say. We'll get to that. Scott MacFarlane joins me here at the desk. Scott? Comey indictment gone and to never come back?
It looks fatally wounded. The one against Letitia James looks grievously wounded. Okay. There's a Monty Python joke somewhere in there. We'll leave that for another time. This thing was always dangling by a thread. Mm-hmm. It was from the start. There were so many things weighing down on these two cases. The allegations of vindictive prosecution. In Comey's case, an allegation of a mishandling of the grand jury, allegations of literal truth, that Comey can't be making false statements if what he said is literally true. But this is the one that cut the thread, the unlawful appointment of a prosecutor. You can't get past that, in part because, as the judge said in her 29-page ruling, this is the only prosecutor who put her name on the case. This is the only prosecutor who faced the grand jury that secured the indictment against James Comey and the grand jury that secured the indictment against Letitia James. There's no backup. There's no second chair.
James Comey had a video that he put together that he released right after this was announced. Let's watch some of it.
I'm grateful that the court ended the case against me, which was a prosecution based on malevolence and incompetence, and a reflection of what the Department of Justice has become under Donald Trump, which is heartbreaking.
Comey also added this about what he thinks might still come his way. Let's watch that.
I know that Donald Trump will probably come after me again, and my attitude's going to be the same. I'm innocent, I am not afraid, and I believe in an independent federal judiciary.
The question of statute of limitations looms over this prosecution, does it not?
Yeah, the White House said that the facts of the cases haven't changed. They're trying to suggest or indicate that they will proceed again, but the statute of limitations is gone. I think one of the arguments that was being made here by the defense is that they were rushing things in the James Comey case to beat that deadline, that 5-year statute of limitations for criminal misconduct that allegedly happened in September 2020. But to resuscitate it, there's all kinds of thresholds they're going to have to surmount, in addition to the ones that were weighing down that thread from the start. The allegations of vindictive prosecution and the allegation that there was something going on with the grand jury that shouldn't have happened, that they saw a second copy of an indictment that wasn't shared with the entire grand jury. Those problems haven't gone away. Oh, by the way, they have to find a prosecutor to run this office, the U.S. Attorney of the Eastern District of Virginia, one of the most powerful, largest federal prosecutor offices in America. And in this case, they'd have to find somebody willing to bring these cases, which obviously others were not willing to bring.
And you said Letitia James's case grievously, not fatally wounded. Why is it in a different category?
Still faces that hurdle of they got to find a prosecutor to run the office who's willing to bring this case.
But the statute of limitations isn't an issue there.
They haven't surpassed the statute of limitations, which it opens the door quite much more widely than it is with James Comey. It doesn't preclude anything.
Got it. Scott MacFarlane is always brilliant. Thank you so very much. CBS News legal analyst Caroline Polisi joins me now for more analysis. Caroline, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Break down what you conclude from today's judicial actions.
Yeah, well, Major, as Scott was noting there, we really just got a really small slice of analysis here. The judge today was ruling on a consolidated basis with the Tish James motion to dismiss and the James Comey motion to dismiss because they had similar legal arguments, which was that Lindsay Halligan was not lawfully appointed. So we didn't get into any of these other issues with the material facts of these indictments. So the issue today was literally only whether or not Lindsay Halligan was appointed lawfully by Pam Bondi under the Appointments Clause of the Constitution and statutory law. And what the judge noted is that no, she was not. There is essentially one shot. The Attorney General gets one shot at appointing an interim United States attorney when there is a vacancy. And after that 120 days, the authority to appoint an interim United States attorney goes to the district court, or the president can make an appointment and have that appointee confirmed by the Senate under the Appointments Clause. And so the government can't simply do an end run around the law and the Constitution in order to put whomever they want in that position ad infinitum, essentially. So that was the narrow issue here. Scott hit the nail on the head. I think there was some ambiguity in her ruling with respect to this rebringing of the case potentially. It's not her issue to decide how to move forward, but the case does leave it a bit ambiguous in the case of Comey, how they would proceed, whether the statute of limitations will essentially end this case. But, even in the case of Tish James, Lindsay Halligan will no longer be serving as the as the acting United States Attorney General in the Eastern District of Virginia. So the DOJ will have to find somebody willing to indict these cases again that is appointed by the district court or affirmed by the Senate. And that is a tall order.
And Caroline, you're familiar with defense tactics. If you're a defense attorney, and there are many for James Comey and Letitia James, do you look at today as basically a slam dunk, we're forever in the clear, or at least part of a legal background that if you need to, if the indictments are reintroduced, you have more behind you than you had when this day began?
Yeah, not a slam dunk, maybe a three-pointer, because remember what both defendants were asking the judge to rule here was dismissal with prejudice, meaning a full stop dismissal. The DOJ cannot rebring this case. The judge decided that the remedy in this instance, even though Lindsay Halligan was unlawfully appointed and that it's an invalid indictment in each case, that the dismissal would be without prejudice, meaning the DOJ can, if they can get it together, they could re-indict. But because the facts of these cases are so shaky and the substance, remember Scott was pointing to all these issues in the grand jury, particularly in the Comey case, issues with how they obtained the evidence, issues with how they looked through that evidence. There are a lot of ways that this case could fall. Yes, it's a win for the defense today, but trust me, this is not the end of these cases. We will hear appeals and potentially the cases will be brought again. It's not over, but huge win for the defense for sure.
And if it comes back and we need further education, analysis, and guidance, we will turn to you as always. Caroline Polisi, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
President Trump today held a phone call with Chinese President Xi Jinping. They talked about many things: Ukraine, Russia, soybeans, and the like. We turn now to our Willie James Inman at the White House. Willie, here we go, straight ahead. It said turn, and I turn when it says turn, but no, it's straight ahead. Willie James, it's great to see you. I brought up soybeans because, yes, there are international policy issues that the two discuss, but for American agriculture, soybeans is a big deal.
Yeah, that's right, Major. Remember, those farmers that grow soybeans have really been operating at a loss because, in large part, China has turned to other countries in South America, for instance, to purchase those soybeans. But that was a major sticking point in those conversations between President Trump and President Xi that happened in South Korea. Now, the president described this call as a good phone call, and the press secretary said that it lasted for about an hour. And as you mentioned, there were trade discussions in this phone call, but also Russia and Ukraine came up as well. So perhaps the president giving President Xi an update in terms of those conversations that are happening between Russia, Ukraine, and the United States, playing the mediator there. But the president also mentioning that President Xi invited him to Beijing next year in April, and that he accepted that invitation. And also, Major, the president said later in the year that he will host President Xi for a state visit here at the White House. So certainly that could perhaps improve the relationship between China and the United States amid all of this trade situation. Certainly that has been up in the air, but the president seemingly working to improve that relationship, at least day by day, and including with this phone call that we heard about earlier today.
And it's worth reminding our viewers, Willie James, that when the war between Russia and Ukraine, which Russia launched, was not very old, Russia and China said they were very closely aligned in all sorts of security and policy respects. The president, perhaps using this phone call to read in the Chinese leader about where negotiations stand, Russia and Ukraine, brings them tighter into that circle. And has the White House said anything more today about what it believes the status of those talks with Ukraine are, and the Europeans as well?
Yeah, you make an excellent point. Amid these ongoing conversations that also include the Europeans, we saw over the weekend Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's also the national security advisor, saying that these conversations were productive, that the president was happy about the conversations. He read the president into those details that happened over the weekend. You see a picture there of those American officials, including Steve Witkoff, there at the table with the Ukrainians. There are certainly some key factors that need to be hammered out, because this deal, as it stood, some lawmakers were concerned that it heavily favored the Russians. The U.S. says that they authored this deal, presented both sides with the deal, and worked with both sides to come up with it. But still, nonetheless, Zelensky likely pushing back against that land swap or land deal. Certainly some details that still need to be worked out, Major.
Willie James Inman, North Lawn of the White House. Thanks so much. I want to bring in the co-founder of American Dynamism, Catherine Boyle. Her organization invests in companies that support the national interest of the United States. She is also well known for her ties to Vice President J.D. Vance. It's great to have you with us. What is your perspective on where things stand with these conversations? As Willie James Inman just pointed out, Secretary of State Rubio has had a lot of explaining to do about the origins of this 28-point peace plan. Was it heavily influenced by the Russians? Is it an ultimatum? Is there a deadline of Thursday of Thanksgiving for the Ukrainians? There's a lot still hanging in the air, seemingly in limbo.
Yes, well, I think the tone coming out of today was much more optimistic than over the weekend. But I also think it's emblematic of how this administration likes to get things done. It is often messy. It is often moving extremely fast. And there's often a lot of changes that come in by the hour. And so, if we look back to the peace process for Israel and Gaza, there were a lot of surprises in those conversations as well. Similarly, those conversations were led by what the Financial Times called deal guys, not diplomats, and came to a solid conclusion. And so I think you're seeing in some ways the same playbook play out, which is here are 28 points. Here are ideas that are around the table. How do we get everyone to the table and negotiate? That is how this administration likes to do business and really likes to conduct foreign affairs.
And why do you believe the Army Secretary in the latter stages of this became such an important conversationalist and communicator with the Ukrainians? Because heretofore, Army Secretary Driscoll wasn't visible, now very visible. Why do you think that is?
I think it is a very important thing to call out that he is in these conversations. For the last 10 months, he has been very focused on production, on modernizing the U.S. Army, and really focused on making sure that the defense industrial base beefs up its munitions development. This is something that has been, talked about for the last few years, that Russia and China have really been building their defense industrial bases during this war, and the U.S. has been lagging. And that there isn't an infinite stockpile of missiles and munitions that we can supply the Ukrainians. And so I think him being at that table is a huge signifier that production and that the munitions capacity that we have as a country is being strained by a war that is entering its fourth year. That is definitely been a strain on the defense industrial base. And it's also a note that, this is an administration that is starting to look more to other theaters, particularly the Indo-Pacific, much more focused on China than the previous administration. And so I think in some ways, this is sort of a very I would say a fast-moving conversation for a reason, and that is because there are other priorities that the administration is focusing on.
To that point, Catherine, how do you evaluate, and I don't think it was a coincidence, President Trump talking to President Xi today of China in this context?
I think he realizes that he is a very important player, not only in this negotiation, but in future negotiations. And it is a nod to the fact that we have to hurry things up. The vice president said that in a tweet today, noting that the priorities of most Americans are things like the cost of housing. There's domestic issues that Americans want to be focused on, and that China is really becoming, I think, in many ways, the focal point of the administration going forward. So it's no surprise that conversation happened today, that Ukraine came up, and that the president is trying to build that bridge for future negotiations.
Catherine, it's already been established by this administration that the Europeans have to fund purchases of munitions and missiles for the Ukrainians, not the United States provide them without any payment in return. That's a big shift. Isn't that an important signifier that the Europeans are now putting their money on the table and they're going to have a voice in this as well?
Absolutely. I think it is very important that Europe steps up and starts funding its defense, and has done so. I think it's been a very important part of how this war has played out. But at the same time, they're at a lag. There has not been decades of investment in Europe in their industrial capacity. And so they are at a great disadvantage when it comes to competing head to head with other nation states. I'd say the same thing with the U.S. There is not an infinite amount of munitions. We do not have enough factories. We do not have enough ways to build up a depleted munitions capability. And so that's something that the Secretary of the Army has talked about the need to invest in the American industrial base, to focus on conflicts of the future, to focus on weapon systems of the future, and not be looking towards the past. And so I think him being in these conversations is part of that appeal. But it's also something that is really kind of top of mind, I would say, for this administration, is moving forward from this conflict.
Catherine Boyle, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Still to come tonight, Arizona Democratic Senator Mark Kelly, Gulf War naval aviator, former space shuttle commander, now the subject of a potential court-martial proceeding. The trigger? Last week's video featuring Kelly and 5 other Democrats urging military and intelligence personnel to uphold the Constitution and defy unlawful orders. Those are their words. Plus, new CBS News polling shows most Americans do not understand the goals or the policy in Venezuela. This as U.S. military assets grow in number and draw nearer to that country. And you've heard it said many times. You might have even said it yourself. The rent is too damn high. Homeowners can say that about mortgage rates and insurance, too. What to do about housing affordability? It's an issue Democrats missed by a lot on in 2024. Well, there's some new ideas, and we'll take a look at them. The Takeout returns in 90 seconds. Welcome back. The Pentagon now investigating Arizona Democratic Senator Mark Kelly and says he alone, among 6 Democrats in last week's video, is subject to disciplinary proceedings up to and including court-martial. Kelly is a retired Navy captain. Kelly says he will not be silenced by, quote, bullies. This comes just days after President Trump accused Kelly and other Democratic lawmakers of, quote, seditious conspiracy over that video, which I'm sure you remember, telling military members that they can and should disobey illegal orders. The Pentagon today reminded service members they have a, quote, legal obligation to obey, quote, lawful orders. Caitlin Huey-Burns joins me now from Capitol Hill. Quite a bit to unpack here, Caitlin, including Senator Kelly's response to learning he is now under some form of investigation that could lead to discipline.
And that's right. And he's the only member of the group of Democrats that were part of that video. And according to the Department of Defense's statement here, it's because he's the only one out of that group that is officially retired. So technically, he is still part of the Pentagon's purview. That's their explanation of it. As you know, as you mentioned, Senator Kelly himself, former Navy, former astronaut, as many people know him more recently, came out and said that he learned about this through social media, that he was made aware of this in the first place because of the Pentagon's social media post. Our Margaret Brennan reported that as well. And so he said he is undeterred about this investigation, but it is notable, Major, because going into the weekend, we were talking up here about how the threats to lawmakers had already been steadily on the rise over the last few years, and increasingly so this year, according to Capitol Police. Of course, only intensified by the president's comments. And these lawmakers, including Kelly, have been concerned and kind of raising alarms about their own security in light of these threats. Now, Congress is out of session right now. It's pretty empty here behind me, as you can tell. But we've seen a lot of Democrats come to Kelly's defense, including a very forceful video statement from his colleague Ruben Gallego, who really did not mince words.
This is insane. We should all point out how insane this is. And, you know, if these guys are trying to say that they're not acting like fascists, they're not trying to give as much power to this president as a king, then they should stop acting like it.
So a couple of expletives there, as you heard, but that gives you the sense of how intensely frustrated that his colleagues are that this is happening. And we haven't really heard much from Republicans, at least at this point, coming to Kelly's defense, but we will stay tuned.
Caitlin Huey-Burns on Capitol Hill. Thank you so very much. President Trump has said prices are dropping and inflation is barely a factor in American life. New CBS News polling shows 60% of Americans believe Trump is saying things are, quote, better than they really are, unquote. And there's more. All the numbers. Next on The Takeout. Welcome back. Thanks for hanging out with us. We have new survey data on Venezuela, inflation, and the economy. To bring it to us, your friend and mine, CBS News Executive Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, take it away.
Hey there. We are nothing if not versatile, Major, right? A lot of stuff. I'm going to start with the first thing you mentioned, Venezuela. And what's happening there is majority opposition to the idea of U.S. military action. But behind that is that 3/4 of the public told us that they don't think the administration has explained what the U.S. position is on that. And that's underpinning that opposition. And then you get this, where only 13% say they consider Venezuela a major threat. One other quick note here, which is that MAGA Republicans are more supportive of this than non-MAGA Republicans. And what is interesting about that is you look at these foreign policy issues, there's some talk, some punditry, oh, does this divide or split the MAGA base? The answer here is no. MAGA has been behind the president. They are across so many issues, and majority of them supportive here too, Major.
Well, I would just jump in on that, Anthony, because that 66-34, usually the alignment is 80-20, 90-10. There's a little bit of restiveness in the MAGA movement.
Indeed, and I am glad you mentioned that because look at this. MAGA, most of them still say that he needs to explain the position. I showed you a moment ago that a lot of people think he hasn't. MAGA is among them. Explain what's going on. Tell us more. That's a common theme through this. And yes, it goes through most of MAGA as well. The other part is, if you just ask people in general, what does America First policy mean? Right? Among Republicans, the bulk of them say it means you can get involved overseas, internationally, to promote the U.S.'s own interests, not just stay out entirely. And the way that connects here is that there are a lot of MAGA Republicans who say that if the U.S. took action, it could decrease the amount of drugs coming into the U.S. So they're listening to a lot of the administration arguments on that, even though, like I said, they're still asking, like all Americans, to know more.
Anthony, economy, inflation.
Economy, inflation. Americans think there is too much inflation, or at least too high prices. Ratings of the economy down even lower than they've been very quickly because prices are still seen as going up. And as you mentioned at the earlier segment, You've got 6 in 10 who think the administration is making things with inflation sound better than they really are. That's a bit of a disconnect. Yes, the president's going to be positive. He's going to be upbeat. But that disconnect is one of the reasons why he's had declining ratings overall on handling the economy and handling inflation. That's the story there.
Anthony Salvanto, as always, thank you so very much. I want to bring in our reporter panel, investigative journalist for Notice. Remember, that's News of the U.S., Dave Leventhal, and Tia Mitchell, Washington bureau chief for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Tia, I'm so glad you're here because there was an earthquake a little bit in politics, not just in Georgia, but in Washington. Friday night, Marjorie Taylor Greene says she's not running for re-election. Not only that, she's going to retire in early January. Break it down for us.
Well, I think it comes down to when Marjorie Taylor Greene first came to Congress in 2020, she envisioned herself as someone who would be working alongside Donald Trump, pursuing his America First MAGA agenda. But remember, for the first 4 years, it was Marjorie Taylor Greene who was in office. Donald Trump was not in office. So it was, I think, easier in theory for her to fight alongside him when he was talking and not having to do. And now that Donald Trump is back in the White House serving a second term, I think Marjorie Taylor Greene became increasingly critical of some of the policies coming out of the White House, saw daylight between what she felt Republican voters had been promised by Trump and what he was actually giving them. And the more vocal she became, the more there was a split. And then the Epstein files really took it over the edge because, again, she said, I've been saying for years, we should release the Epstein files. I'm not going to change that. And Donald Trump, of course, didn't like that. And once he turned on her and began to criticize her, Marjorie Taylor Greene announced on Friday that she didn't really envision serving in Congress as an adversary to Donald Trump. That's not something she wants to do. And therefore, she decided to step away.
Very quickly, in Georgia, does she have a statewide future?
I think if she wanted one, I think all the polling, everyone agrees, she would be a very tough candidate for any Republican to beat in a primary. But she would be challenged in a general election. Now, whether that stops her from running, we don't know.
Right.
But that's probably the reality in Georgia.
Dave, your thoughts?
Well, Marjorie Taylor Greene certainly has a future. What that future is going to look like is up in the air. But my colleague Reese Gorman at Notice, he wrote a couple of weeks ago that she has considered the presidency. She denies that she's doing that, but at the same time, too, one has to wonder if she's going to seek the U.S. Senate, if she is going to run for president in 2028. And I mean, this is somebody who has basically drawn a line in the sand and say, hey, if you want to be MAGA, you can't be part of the tech oligarchy or supporting that. If you want to be MAGA, you can't embrace a military-industrial complex. And you certainly can't withhold the Epstein files after saying all along, Donald Trump, that you were going to do so up until the time you gained power in the White House.
I want to play for you both something that Alyssa Slotkin said about the economy, where it is now. Anthony Salvanto just captured the disconnect between White House messaging and the public at large. Right. But Alyssa Slotkin took it back to the Biden years as well. Please listen.
I would argue that one of the things that he's been doing by repeating it and talking about it is trying to distract us from the big stories of last week, which were the Epstein files and then the economy. And I took note yesterday at 9 o'clock at night. He's tweeting that there's no inflation, the economy's the best it's ever been. It was kind of amazing considering that the American public isn't stupid. It actually reminded me of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden tried to tell us for a year that the economy was great.
Joe Biden gaslighting America on economy. Alyssa Slotkin, call your office. Tia?
So I do think, again, if we go back to Marjorie Taylor Greene, over the summer and into the fall, and especially during the government shutdown, one of her main messages was Republicans are being tone deaf on where voters are.
They're missing something.
That they're missing something, that they're not responding to the fact that regular people of America are concerned about the rising cost of goods.
And
they're
frustrated.
Concerned about rising health care costs. And what Marjorie Taylor Greene has been saying is that the Republican Party doesn't have an answer. You can't just say things are going well. And that's where
there was evidence in the Georgia Public Service Commission election.
Absolutely. That was all
People
about
were ticked off about utility costs.
Absolutely. And 2 Republican incumbents lost. We haven't had Democrats on the PSC in quite some time in Georgia.
Dave?
When you dig into the poll numbers that you cited, people in America have not thought that the economy is good really at any point during Donald Trump's first year of his second term. But the big difference is you look at one of those charts and it shows basically, who do you blame for it? And the numbers for Donald Trump, they started relatively high because that was the Joe Biden effect. They were still blaming the previous administration, but they have been just going down and down and down to the lowest point now today that they have been all year. And that's a big problem for Donald Trump because he is past the point of being able to blame Joe Biden for all the bad things that were happening. He's got to own it at some point. And the public right now is saying, well, Donald Trump, this is your time to own it.
And probably the beginning of that was in July when they passed the big, beautiful bill and President said, you're going to start seeing and feeling all the great effects of this legislation that only we and Republicans could put it through. We did it. We own it. Now, yes, indeed, Mr. President, you own it. Tia Mitchell, Dave Leventhal, always a pleasure. Great to have you with us. Can Democrats build something other than a Potemkin village out of housing affordability? Our next guest says yes, and you can decide if that's true. That's next here on The Takeout. Welcome back to The Takeout. Some housing numbers, and brace yourself. There's going to be more than one or two numbers, so pay attention. A third of all American households spend more than 30% of their income on rent or mortgage payments. Rent has increased 35% since the start of COVID lockdowns. The median age of a first-time homebuyer in America is now 40 years old, up from 31 years old in 2014. So what to do? Jared Bernstein joins me now. He's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and co-author of a paper on how to rapidly increase housing supply in America. Jared, I should also point out, was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Biden. Jared, good to see you. Let me do you a favor. Ask you to acknowledge up front that on the credibility score, someone who worked for the Biden administration has some explaining to do while this problem was allowed to continue on your watch.
Yeah, no question. We were certainly trying to make the kinds of policy plays that we talk about in the report you just mentioned, but we were definitely unable to legislate them. We actually got pretty far, but at least at one point, Senator Manchin blocked the vote on this. So it is unquestionably the case that we can't move forward without congressional support. And that's where these policies that I'm happy to take you through really start out.
So one of the things I noticed is essentially identifying a numerical goal of increasing housing stock over a 5-year period. But 5 years is a long way away. Why can't it happen faster?
Oh, we think it can happen faster. We think we can start adding units within a year or two. But to do so, we're going to have to get a lot of states and localities and cities and towns to do something they haven't done for decades, which is to pull back some of the regulatory sludge that keeps them from building affordable housing in a quick and efficient manner. And, the American people, they want to see a delivery here. Your question is very, I think, on point. And in order to hit those delivery marks quickly, we suggest that we make a deal with these communities. We sign what's called an affordability contract. We will help them finance the building of affordable housing, and we will, right out of the gate, start helping people with assistance on their rents, which, as you mentioned, has grown quickly, if they take down the barriers to building that are making building so expensive and are responsible for this 2 million unit shortfall that we document in our piece. If they fail to keep our end of the contract, they actually lose grants, transportation grants, Commerce Department grants. So this is a carrot and stick approach. It's one that hasn't been tried before.
Jared, let me get really nerdy with you on this, because my home state of California has gone through a lot in terms of a affordability crisis and supply crisis. And jurisdictions like my hometown of San Diego have encouraged building auxiliary domestic units in backyards of existing single-family homes, which sounds great, but some of the problems are this. In a backyard, units of 4 and 5 and 6 dwellings are going up in backyards, meaning 6 units in one backyard. There's no infrastructure for that. There's no parking for that. And this stresses out communities and creates a political backlash that is resistant to the very thing you just described about this grand bargain with states and localities.
Right. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this. The wrong way to do this is to try to jam units into places that don't have the infrastructure to support them. The right way is for the federal government to work with states and localities, to work with local programs. By the way, that's another part of our report where we suggest helping to capitalize local programs that are already making a difference with public-private funds for subsidized affordable housing, to do that together in a way that involves planning around the very problems you mentioned. We actually have a supportive fund in our plan to help with infrastructure, to help with sewers, and to help with roads and even slots in schools. By the way, this is also part of the Road Act, that thing we're just talking about right now, that supportive fund, which is a bipartisan act. So at least there are members on both sides of the aisle who are recognizing the dysfunction you just described and recognizing that we need a bold way to move forward, where in high-cost areas signed an affordability contract with the federal government. They live up to their part, start building units. We live up to our part, helping to finance those units and help their renters who are stressed with affordability.
And when it comes to homes, where do you come down on this idea recently floated of a 50-year mortgage?
It doesn't do what you and I are talking about. It doesn't increase the supply of housing. The reason we're in the hole we're in is it's not complicated. It's Econ 101. We have at least 2 million shortfall of units in general and affordable units in particular. And a 50-year mortgage just means that it's going to take you that much longer to build up any home equity. And if the interest rate on that mortgage goes up, which it would, it's going to cost more to lock up 50 years than 30 years. Even any monthly payment benefit you might get from that longer maturity starts to fade pretty quickly. Look, the only way to make progress here is to build more housing. And that's why our programs here, we haven't even yet talked about manufactured and modular housing. It's a very important solution that some other countries are getting the hang of. We're way behind on that. That's another path to affordability. Affordability contracts between the federal government and localities, helping to build on to some programs that are already working in some of these areas. Modular manufactured housing, all of them are targeted at increased supply. The 50-year mortgage idea doesn't get you there.
Center for American Progress's Jared Bernstein. Jared, always a pleasure. Thank you. Still to come, how Mount Rushmore came to be. The author of a new book about a complicated story of tourism, nationalism, and daring joins me next. Welcome back. More than 2 million visitors each year travel to Mount Rushmore. And of course, that phrase is synonymous with greatness. It's now 100 years old, Mount Rushmore, and a new book digs into the sculpture, its origins, its meanings, which, like America itself, are layered with achievement and fault. Earlier, I spoke to Matthew Davis about his new book, A Biography of a Mountain, The Making and Meaning of Mount Rushmore. Here is some of our conversation. America is a place of tremendous ambition, complexity, contradiction, myth, legend, cruelty. As I read your book, Matthew, I thought, wow, Mount Rushmore has it all.
Yeah, it does. And that's what really interested me about writing it. I felt when I was researching it that Mount Rushmore really is at the center of all those myths you just described, our westward push, our really fraught relationships with Native communities, our search for gold, the way that democracy, liberty, freedom have sort of been embodied in our blood, but also at Mount Rushmore. And then, of course, our great creative ambition to build huge things like Mount Rushmore. It's all there in that mountain.
And that's, I think, from the book, I gather one of its magnetic qualities.
I think it is. Yeah, I mean, it's what drew me there. It's what draws millions of people there. 2 million a year. Yeah, in excess of 2 million a year. Yeah.
And it is, in part, something, even if you haven't been to, you feel like you know. But your book is like, no, there's so much more. Whether you go there or not, you need to know.
Yeah.
Fill in some of the blanks that people may not know, but need to know about Mount Rushmore.
Well, first of all, writing a book is about something that people you think know, but they don't really know. Reading a book about something that you think you know but you don't really know is one of my favorite things to do. So being able to write one was great. I think the first thing that many people don't know about Mount Rushmore, because it's so big, because it's so monumental, for lack of a better word, people assume that the federal government was behind it from the very beginning, when really my favorite part of the story is that the idea for Mount Rushmore was created by a state historian named Doane Robinson, who in the 1920s was really concerned about South Dakota's economy. At the time, South Dakota's markets were collapsing because World War I had devastated European markets, but when they recovered, the markets in South Dakota really tanked. And so banks were closing, farms were foreclosing.
As I read in your book, South Dakota was a pre-Depression era state, 10 years ahead of time.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It sort of was the precursor to what was about to come down the line several years later for the entire country.
So it needed some kind of elixir, and Doane Robinson thought tourism might be one of them.
He did, yeah. There were a bunch of cars and car tourists that were driving around that part of the country. And
what do we do?
He felt it would be a really great idea to carve sculptures into the Black Hills to attract these tourists that were moving around the state at the time. And so his idea was to create figures that were representative of the American West.
But not the figures we see on Mount Rushmore.
Not the figures we see at Mount Rushmore. And that's crucial to the story, because the idea that Doane Robinson had was really an economic idea. It was one of tourism. He wanted to diversify the economy. But when Doane Robinson hired Gutzon Borglum as a sculptor, the idea began to shift to one of politics. Economics was still there, of course, but the political aspect of it really got going.
And Doane was okay with the idea of this original monument in his mind representing key white American figures of Western expansion, but also Native peoples.
Well, Doane initially did want to have the Lakota leader Red Cloud, wanted to have Lewis and Clark, Custer Sacagawea, who was the guide for Lewis and Clark. And so Doane Robinson's idea was much more diverse in terms of what it ended up becoming. But it should be said that Doane Robinson wasn't necessarily upset in the direction that Mount Rushmore eventually went to. He had, especially initially, a great deal of awe and respect for Gutzon Borglum, the sculptor.
Talk to my audience about who Gutzon Borglum was and the complexities in his life.
He is a fascinating character, a fascinating man. He is an amazing artist, very talented artist, who really grew up from the middle of American Earth. I mean, he was born to a Mormon immigrant family from Denmark, and he was born in what is now Idaho. But as his family moved moved east, the polygamy that his father practiced became more illegal as they moved east. And so Gutzon Borglum, his birth mom was a woman named Christina Mickelson, and she was married to his father, but so was her sister. So the two sisters were married to the same man. Gutzon happened to be born to the younger of the two sisters. And when they came to the middle of the United States and that polygamy was illegal, they had to make a decision. And the decision was to ask Gutzon's mother to leave the family. And so when Gutzon was 5 years old, he said goodbye to his mother for the first time. He said goodbye to his mother, and that was it. He never saw her again. So it was a very traumatic experience for young Gutzon. But he eventually moved to Los Angeles as a teenager, really developed his artwork, became passionate about art, went to Europe for about a decade there, and really grew as an artist, as a sculptor. He was someone who studied with and learned a lot about Auguste Rodin, the French sculptor. And when he came back to the United States in the early 20th century, he said, I'm going to be a sculptor, and I'm going to be an American sculptor.
You can listen to the rest of my conversation with Matthew Davis on your favorite podcast platform. Happy Monday, everyone. This is The Takeout, relentlessly curious, reliably civil, and occasionally clever. The Daily Report, coming up next.